Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our Parent Carer workshop. Today's topic is problem solving behaviour, and in this presentation we'll be thinking about how we can use different techniques to help make sense of your child's behaviour and some strategies that we can use to help promote positive behaviour. So let's think about our plan for today. We're going to start by thinking about what do we actually mean by the term behaviour, and there's going to be some important facts to note before we move on and start thinking about different strategies to help problem solve behaviour. So problem solving, we're going to be using two techniques, one called the iceberg and one called the star, and I'll explain in more detail as we go through the presentation. Finally, we're going to end by thinking about positive behaviour management techniques that can be used with your children to help encourage positive behaviour. So as these sessions are not live, the information provided is just general information about children with autism based on research and my own experience of working with autistic children. So therefore you may have some questions about the content or perhaps how this relates to your own child. If you do have any questions, then please send an email to the address that's on the slide, which is theautismservice@cognus.org.uk. If you put your question in an email and perhaps provide some contact details, then someone will get back to you answering this as soon as possible. So firstly, let's think about your child's behaviour and what is this trying to tell us? So children's behaviour can be very informative and can be seen as a form of communication. So when your child is behaving in a certain way, this tends to be because they're trying to tell us something. For example, if we're thinking about babies, they tend to cry to tell us if they're hungry, tired, or perhaps thirsty. As we get older, we develop different ways to communicate, but one form of communication is the way that we behave. So we want to be trying to think about what is trying to be said, what is our child trying to tell us. So, for example, if your child has a happy face on them, then you might be able to say from that, okay, they're happy at this moment, they're really enjoying that activity. But perhaps maybe if they're withdrawn or they're crying, we might want to start thinking, what is going on around our child? What are they trying to tell us, even if they aren't using verbal communication or words? And if your child isn't using verbal communication to communicate this, then they may be using their behaviour. So it's a really useful source to help understand what is going on for your child. So first, let's have a look at the different areas that our children may be experiencing difficulties in. So firstly, we have social interaction. So for autistic children, this can be a very anxiety-provoking situation, trying to make small talk with other people around them, forming those friendships. So that can be really anxiety-provoking and can make your children behave in particular ways. So thinking about social interaction, some of the difficulties that your child may come across is establishing and maintaining friendships. They may prefer online friendships because this takes away some of the pressure. They're behind a screen, they have time to form their responses, they've got time to process what the person is saying. So that can help reduce the anxiety, which means it may be easier to form friendships online. Again, honesty can play a role in this. Autistic children can sometimes have very black and white thinking and be very rule-based, which in turn might lead them to be honest when someone perhaps has broken these rules, which can again affect that social interaction with people around them. Empathy. Empathy can be very difficult for autistic children to read and understand and show. So again, this can really interfere with social interactions and can make that really tricky, a tricky thing to do really, because they might not be understanding how someone else is feeling and may not be able to respond to this in an appropriate way. Reading social cues can also be quite difficult for a child with autism. This could be because they perhaps aren't understanding the situation around them. They haven't had time to process this. And also, as humans, we tend to use very subtle cues. So we may use more facial expressions. We may use subtle hand movements. Our body language can tell us a lot about how we're feeling, how we are feeling in a social interaction, which autistic children may find very difficult to pick up. So just being aware that social cues can be very subtle and may not be picked up by autistic children in social interactions. They may also seem to behave in a socially inappropriate way. So sometimes parents describe their autistic children as not having a filter and they just sort of say what they see without thinking, Should I be saying that? Am I in the right environment? Do I know this person well enough? So again, that can really interfere with social interactions and make them quite difficult. Finally, autistic children have been noted to like time alone. So they may withdraw in the playground and pretend to prefer to play on their own, or tend to be sort of in the corner on a bench on their own. And that is because sometimes autistic children do like to have time alone. So they like to have that time away from perhaps the pressures of these social interactions, or the environment that around them might be too busy. So they like to take themselves off. But other times they may also be lonely. Because of these difficulties they may be having with social interaction, they may feel quite isolated and lonely because they're not sure how to interact in these situations. So all of these things that I've mentioned and that are on the slide can be quite difficult for a child to socially interact, which then may impact their behaviour and help us to understand more about that. Another area where children with autism may experience some difficulties is with social communication. So, individuals with autism cannot always understand the implications of tones of voice. So, the tone in which we use a word can alter the meaning of a word dramatically. So, if a person with autism asks if you're okay and you answer yes, but with a sigh and your head bowed down low, they'll make the assumption that you are fine because you've said yes, without picking up that your tone of voice and your body language which perhaps suggest otherwise. Therefore, we want to be really aware that the language that we are using is clear and represents exactly what we are trying to say and how we feel. Another part of social communication that can be difficult is, as humans, we quite often use idioms and unusual phrases in our conversations with others. For example, it's raining cats and dogs out there, or come on now, I want you to pull your socks up, we've got to get going. Those sort of phrases can be very difficult to understand and can be quite confusing for autistic children. And this is because autistic children can take language like that quite literally. So, for example, if you do say, come on, pull up your socks, they might bend down and pull up their socks without realizing that this is a figure of speech. And a personal example I had is once I went to the school office and asked to speak to a member of staff, and the office lady turned around and said, "Oh, she's a bit tied up at the moment," and the child's face just kind of dropped because he was thinking that the lady was actually physically tied up in her office, and I had to explain that that just means it's a phrase. It just means that they're busy. So yeah, just being really aware about the language choices that we are using, because this can be very confusing for a child with autism. And often we do not say exactly what we mean. Sometimes we might sort of skate around an issue and hoping that someone takes the hint. But for autistic children, they perhaps won't be taking this hint. So we want to be sure that we're being very clear and very formal and straight to the point about what we are saying. So just being aware of the language choices that we are using, because this can affect how a autistic child communicates with us and their understanding, and perhaps impacts how they behave following the verbal communication that they have received. Another area that autistic children may experience difficulties in is with social imagination and flexibility of thought. Rules and routines play an important part in all of our lives, but are especially important to those who are autistic. Many autistic children are insistent on certain rules and routines that they follow on a regular basis, and can find change quite difficult because this can be seen as quite a stressful and anxiety provoking experience. Therefore, you may have found with your children that when you're planning to go to maybe perhaps a new environment or a new place that your child hasn't been before, you have to do a lot of preparation about planning well in advance for this so they can be prepared about what they are going to be expected there. You may also have found with autistic children that play skills might be limited and not necessarily traditional. So, for example, building blocks, instead of building these up, you may find that autistic children will be lining them up in neat rows rather than building towers. And they may have difficulty in thinking creatively and using their imagination because they have more abstract thinking than concrete thinking. And lastly, individuals with autism can find it difficult to transfer skills from one situation to another. So something that they've learnt at home and then may be asked to do the same task at school may not happen because they may not be able to associate that that's the same behaviour that they done at home and can transfer it to school. So it may be a case that you're having to teach your children how to do a certain behaviour in different environments because that transferring of skills can be seen as quite difficult for them to complete. Finally, autistic children may have a lack of conventional play skills. So, autistic children may tend to play with toys in a unique or unusual way. So, thinking about the example I gave on the previous slide about building blocks, instead of using these to build towers, they may be lining these up in size order. Or again, thinking of perhaps a toy car. Instead of using this as a car and driving it around, they may be more focused on the details of the car, how this is put together, and looking at just the wheels and the mechanisms that are used. Autistic children may also show no interest in conventional toys. They may prefer to play with perhaps the boxes the toys have come in, or thinking about computers and how these are put together, the insides and all the electrics that are inside there, rather than being interested in toys that you could buy from a toy shop. Autistic children may also show a preference for playing on their own. And again, this can relate back to that difficulties with social interaction. So those unspoken rules about turn taking and sharing, they may not be picking up on, or perhaps other children aren't following their rules, or they're not able to follow the rules of other children's games. So it's easier for the children to tend to play on their own because they're following their own rules and they know how to play their game that they've made up in their head. So children with autism may show a preference to playing on their own because of those reasons. So all of these areas that we've mentioned, so social interaction, social communication, flexibility of thought and play, can all be areas that autistic children can find difficulties in, and they may start to behave in a way in relation to these difficulties. Therefore, we want to hold these in mind as it will help us to understand our child's behaviour. Before moving on, there are some important things that we want to note. So, firstly, fear can make people want to control things. In a situation that is deemed as being fearful or scary, children may revert into a role where they're trying to control the situation because this helps make their anxiety and their stress levels at ease. So, you may start to see in autistic children that if they are in a situation that is quite fearful for them, they may start trying to control the adult that's around them because if they can control the situation, then this helps them manage that situation and makes them feel more at ease. Secondly, we tend to learn everything through our senses. So, autistic children can interpret sensory information differently, which can then mean that they can experience a situation differently, which can be very scary. So, if we're thinking about perhaps a firework display, for some people, this is a really enjoyable activity. Seeing the fireworks, it's very exciting. But for someone with autism, their sensory needs around hearing might be overreactive. So they might be taking too much of that sound in, meaning that they're interpreting that situation in a very different way to other people. So for them, they may be viewing the fireworks display as a very stressful situation, probably because there's a lot of people around them, but also that noise level. So again, it's important to note that your child's behaviour may be related to their senses, and that just because we're not experiencing the situation like that doesn't mean that they are. Finally, visuals are really important and that they are a great form of communication to use with autistic children. So, looking at these pictures on the slide, this is an example of Chesterton World Adventures, and they actually give a visual tour of the theme park, and that can be really helpful for autistic children because they've seen what it's going to be like, they know what to expect, and they can prepare. So that can really help with managing your child's anxiety and the behaviour that may come with that. And again, thinking about, so they see the text image, sometimes going back to thinking about social interaction and social communication, that could be a real challenge for autistic individuals. So something like an online text system where they can just reply kind of cuts out that awkward social interaction or that phone call that they might have to make to cancel an appointment. So again, thinking about how we can use visuals to help ease your child's anxiety and also help them to perhaps respond in a way that is easier for them, can really help to alter your child's behaviour, because it's less anxiety provoking for them. Following on from the previous slide, this is just a visual representation of how a child may interpret your requests and then respond. So, for example, you saying iPad finished and then time to clean your teeth, that might be the same as someone saying to perhaps you, wind down and then go and catch a spider. You're not really going to want to do that, especially if you don't know if you're going to be returning to your wine. Therefore, it's important to reassure your children that they will be able to do the things they enjoy again. So just because you're asking them to clean their teeth, their iPad isn't going to be going away forever. So you always want to let them know that they're going to return to this, and that they don't need to panic about that. And if you say to them, you can do your iPad, then you're going to clean your teeth, and then you're going to get into bed and 2 more minutes of iPad time, then stick to that, because they need that reassurance that they're going to be coming back to something that they enjoy. And it's really important to communicate that effectively to your child, and a way of doing that could be using visuals. Firstly, we will start talking about the iceberg analogy when thinking about behaviour. So, what do we know about an iceberg? Looking at the picture, we can see from an iceberg that we can only see really what is on the surface and not what is underneath in the sea. And that's how we can sort of relate to a child and their behaviour. The top of the iceberg is our child's behaviour. This is what we can see, but we can't always understand why they are acting in that way, because the underneath of the iceberg is not always visible. And this is where we want to think a bit more about the underlying causes of the behaviour, as it will help with understanding the child's behaviour which we are seeing. So that behaviour that is on the surface, which is visible to us. So this picture here details the analogy in a bit more detail. So as we can see, using the shape of the iceberg, on top of the surface is the behaviour. So this is what you can see on the surface. What is your child doing? What is their action? So this could be, for example, the crying, maybe they're hitting, maybe they're laughing, maybe they're withdrawn. So that is the actual physical behaviour that we can see. And underneath the surface is what we call the underlying causes. So what is behind the behaviour? Why are they displaying this behaviour? What are they trying to tell us? What, when, who, why, where? So they're all the sort of questions that we want to be asking ourselves to help us make sense of what is on top, and what is make sense of the behaviour that is on top, what we can actually see. So when we're thinking about the underneath iceberg, we want to be thinking about all of these questions, because they'll help piece together and make sense of that behaviour. So this is an iceberg that is in relation to frustration behaviour. So on top, we can see the behaviours that the child is displaying is pushing, hitting, biting, and throwing. And then when we think about perhaps the underlying causes, why are they showing these behaviours? Could it be related to an inability to communicate themselves clearly? People aren't understanding them, so they're becoming frustrated with this. Perhaps they need to let off steam. Maybe they've been frustrated about something that happened at school, and they've been kind of holding in all of their frustration, and they get home and they just need to let it out. And that's when they're displaying these behaviours. Perhaps anxiety about a situation, perhaps something new is happening and they're really anxious about it, and they feel like they can't communicate that verbally, and a way of showing that frustration is through these behaviours. Perhaps they're unaware of the social rules. Perhaps they've said something or acted in a way that people have queried, or perhaps have come back and said, oh, you shouldn't be doing that, and that's just caused them to be frustrated and lead to these behaviours. Or maybe they're unaware of the feelings of other people. Perhaps they're not aware that, these behaviours may result in their parents being upset or being quite distressed because their child is acting that way. So they're not aware of the feelings of other people and how their actions can impact that. And finally, it could be because of an overstimulated environment. Are they at a park where there's lots of loud noises, lots of children? They're having to take turns on the swings. Is that environment just too overstimulating for an autistic child? And their way of responding to that is through these behaviours of frustration. So it's just an idea to show you how perhaps all these behaviours, which aren't, I guess something that you want your child to be participating in can be explained by these underlying causes, and it's about understanding why your child is behaving that way and how you could perhaps ease those behaviours, because I imagine for the child this isn't a very pleasant feeling for them. No one likes to be frustrated. It's about how can you manage that level of frustration and getting them to communicate that in a safer way. So here is another example of how the iceberg analogy can be used to help make sense of a child's behaviour, and this one is in relation to social skills. So the behaviour that we're seeing for this child is greets familiar people with a punch to the arm in quite a rough manner, chooses to be alone, ignores people, talks about interests only, and inappropriate touching of others. So take a minute at home and start to jot down what could some of the underlying causes be for this behaviour. So what's going on, the why questions, when, how, and I guess thinking back to those slides we had at the beginning about social interaction and social communication, and how that sometimes this is difficult for autistic children. So write as much as you can down, and then we'll have a think about some of the answers. Okay, if you need longer, then pause the video, but I'm now going to show you some of the answers. So we've got distracted by specific details, um, not understanding social rules. So going back to that social interaction. So not understanding social rules can make those social interactions really difficult for someone with autism. So that's why they may choose to be alone or ignore people, because they're not understanding that. For example, in a to and fro conversation, someone speaks and you reply and then you ask a question back and so on. So that may result in them ignoring people, but it doesn't mean to come across in this way. Having a short attention span, so they may become bored with the topic that they're talking about, would prefer to talk about their own interests, or even taking themselves away. Unaware of social imagination and that play, so that can affect how children interact with each other. Prefers repetitive actions, so they know what to predict, so having those repetitive actions helps ease that anxiety because it's expected. Unable to communicate with peers, again relating back to that social communication. If they're unable to communicate with their peers, that may result in some of those behaviours, such as choosing to be alone or ignoring people or talking about their own interests, because they're not following, I guess, those social communication rules that perhaps is expected in society. And finally, theory of mind. So again, looking at it now, you can see how some of those underlying causes may result in the behaviour that we're seeing. So take some time at home and think about your own child's behaviours. What behaviours do you see from your child? And use the icebergs to see if you can start to make sense of those behaviours. Are there underlying causes which help make sense as to why they're behaving in that way? And is there anything you can do to help ease these underlying causes? Can you change the environment in some way? Can you present information in a way that's more accessible for them? And it's about adapting the environment around your child to make them feel safer and more at ease. So for you to try at home, here is a blank template of the iceberg. So you want to be thinking about what behaviours are you observing and write them at the top, and what do you think are the underlying causes. So it'd be really useful to try this at home with your children, because drawing it all out and putting it on paper can help us to make so much more sense about why a child is behaving in that particular way. So now we've spoken about using the iceberg analogy to help understand behaviour, we're going to move on and look at another way of analysing behaviour, and this is what we call the STAR analysis. So STAR stands for 4 different words, and it's a bit annoying because it doesn't follow the STAR order. So first of all, we're going to start with the A, which stands for actions. So this is essentially the behaviour in the iceberg. So what can you see? What are the behaviours? So you want to stick to the facts. So these are things that we can definitely see. So they might be the things like the crying or the leaving the room or punching someone. So those are the things that are clear, the facts. They are what we can see. So that is what the A stands for in STAR, actions. The next is S for settings. So this is looking at the environmental conditions around the child. So is it noisy? Is it too bright? Is it busy? Is it a bit smelly? What's going on in their environment? What does the setting look like? You also want to look at the personal conditions. So within settings, we have environmental conditions and we have personal conditions. The personal conditions relates to, is the child hungry? Are they thirsty? Are they tired? What's their mood like? And these different settings can have a big impact on the child. So you've probably all experienced when your children are feeling hungry and how their moods can just change, and trying to get them to do something can be really difficult until you have fed them. And then afterwards, it's like they're a different child. So these settings are really important to think about, both the environmental condition and personal condition, because these can really impact a child's behaviour. Next, we have the T, which stands for triggers. So what could it be that is triggering the behaviour? So this is when your observational skills will come in very useful, because sometimes triggers are subtle. So again, this could relate back to the settings. Is it the environment? Did someone say something to your child? Was there something that happened at school that was a trigger? Was there a change at home that was a trigger? So we want to be thinking about what happened, or what might have caused that behaviour. And triggers are really important, because once we kind of pick up on them, then quite often you can intercept and avoid these triggers, as you know that that is a trigger for your child's behaviour. And lastly, the R, that is for results. So what happened as a result of the behaviour? How did your child respond because of that behaviour? What happened after? Did they refuse to do something, and as a result they didn't have to do it? Because in a way their behaviour has worked. They might have acted in an aggressive way, which meant they didn't have to end up cleaning their teeth. So was their behaviour reinforced by the actions that happened after it? So what were the consequences? Were the consequences negative or positive? And it's sometimes really hard to think about that in the moment of the behaviour, which is why it's great to do the star analysis after, because you can think back and be like, what did I do? How did I respond to that behaviour? What did they get out of doing that behaviour? And it helps us to really think about the results and what your child achieved through their behaviour. So overall, we have these four different parts. So we've got the settings for S, triggers for T, actions for A, and results for R. And that makes up our STAR analysis. So now that we've spoken about what the STAR analysis stands for, it's great to again get all this information down on paper, because it can really help to see this visually and make sense of your child's behaviour. So one way of doing this is putting it in a grid, like you can see on the slides. So you've got the actions, so that's what you've seen, the behaviours, and putting all those in that box. The settings, what was happening at that time? What was the setting? The personal setting, was it just before lunchtime? Was your child hungry? Were you out at the park? Was it noisy? So writing all of those down in the settings box. Triggers, what happened just before that behaviour? What did you notice? Was there a clear trigger? Or perhaps you might not notice anything. Perhaps it just sort of happened, but you might, once you start to think about it, it tends to be that there are things that are triggering your children around them. And then the results, what followed that behaviour? What did you do? And it's important to think about both positive and negative consequences of the behaviour, because it helps us to learn about what your child perhaps is trying to get out of their behaviour, or perhaps it helps us understand, the meaning of the behaviour. So don't put any pressure on yourself, especially if you feel like you've acted in a negative way, and it can feel like that. But it's really important to help make sense of the behaviour, and perhaps why they're repeating it. You may see that your child repeats one behaviour in particular, and it might not be until you write it down in this format that you see actually they get a really positive consequence out of this. They're not having to stay in class because the teacher is making them leave, and they're winning. So it's a real great way to sort of put all the information together in one area and help you to make sense of this. So you can literally do this on an A4 piece of paper, draw out the boxes and focus on one behaviour at a time, because if you're trying to put everything on there all in once, it can get a bit muddled. So focus on one behaviour at a time in a one particular setting, and it can really help to think about the behaviour and what may have caused this. So for the next part of the workshop, we're going to be following a case study called Johnny, and we're going to think about trying to understand his behaviour using both the iceberg and the star analysis. So Johnny is age 8. He has social communication differences. It's lunchtime and it's Johnny's turn to line up for lunch. He's one of the last to line up and is waiting in line for his dinner. Johnny begins to shift his weight from one foot to another and covers his ears with his hands. When it is his turn to be served, the helper asks, "What do you want?" Johnny then throws his tray on the floor and leaves the lunchroom. So just have another read of that in your own time, so you come to terms with the case study and what's going on for Johnny, and then we'll begin to think about this using the iceberg analogy. So here is a reminder of the iceberg analogy. So above the water is the behaviour. So this is what we can see. What is your child doing? What are their actions? And then below the water, below the surface, are the underlying causes. What is behind the behaviour? Why are they displaying the behaviour? What are they trying to tell us? So thinking back to Johnny, what do we think is above the water? So have a think at home. What are the behaviours that we can see? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about that before I tell you some of my suggestions. Okay, so I'm going to give some answers. If you're not ready and you're still thinking about it, then pause the video and come back in your own time. So the behaviours that we see, Johnny puts his hands over his ears. He's shifting his weight from side to side, throwing his tray, running away. So those are the behaviours that we can actually physically see. And we want to try and make sense of these. So in order to try and make sense of these, we need to think about the underlying causes, those parts that are underwater and may not be as clear. So what do you think might be happening under the water, under the surface for Johnny? So again, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to think about that, and then we'll come back and I'll discuss some of the things that I think. Okay, so I'm going to suggest some ideas. Again, if you're not ready, pause the video and come back in your own time. So it could be a lack of understanding, the language that was used. So the person behind the food serving could have used language that perhaps he doesn't understand. They said, "What do you want?" That could be quite confusing for Johnny. Perhaps more specific language needs to be used. Expectations, those social cues that he should have, that expectation that he should know what's going on. He should know that when he gets to the front of the queue, he puts his tray and he chooses his food, but he may not have understood that. Again, the time. Is he hungry? He was last in the line? Did that make him even more panicked? Was his anxiety so high because he had to wait in line, and all of that noise and those sensory overloads happening at that moment in time, it became too anxiety provoking by the time he got there. So again, thinking about the sensory overload, noisy, that if he's in a lunch hall, it's probably quite noisy. The rest of the school chatting is going to be very busy. School hall lights as well, maybe they were too bright for Johnny, and that was causing him to be feeling quite anxious and uncomfortable. The smell as well, the smell of food cooking, children eating their lunch. So again, all of those sensory aspects could be playing a role in making Johnny's anxiety increase and making him feel quite panicked in that situation. So when we're thinking about this behaviour, we want to think about it using sort of an ABC format, where A is the antecedent, so what was happening before the behaviour. B is the behaviour, so what we can see, and C is the consequence, so who gained and what was gained. So similar to like we said about the star analysis, those consequences after. So looking at this using the ABC format, we've got the antecedents could be the waiting time, the questioning, being last in the line, the sensory situation that we just spoke about, the lights, the sounds, the smells, shifting his weight, covering his ears, throwing his tray, running away. They're all the behaviours. So that's the B. So again, thinking about it in the AB format, we've got the antecedents could be the build up to the situation. And then we've got the behaviours, which is the shift in weight, those things that we can see above the iceberg that we've already mentioned. And then the consequences. What did he gain from this? So he was able to leave the room. He might have remained hungry. He might have had to tidy up the tray that he drops. He may have actually got what he wanted. He left that lunch hall. Was that a real positive for him? How did the rest of his day plan out? So there's still a lot of information that would be needed to make sense of this, but thinking about it in an ABC format can help us fill out these underlying causes. And thinking about your own child as well, if this iceberg isn't giving you as much information as you'd hoped, and you're still unsure about why your child is behaving in a certain way, it could also be useful to keep sort of an ABC diary. So in this diary, you might record when you see a behaviour and have a think about what happened before that behaviour and after the behaviour. And after a while of recording this, you might start to see a pattern. So for example, it's always when we go to a certain place that you see that behaviour. Or it might be that when I react in this way, my child gets this and it's a real positive reinforcement. So they're going to do the behaviour again. And sometimes it can be really difficult in the moment to try and realise that. So putting it on paper and just seeing the patterns of keeping behaviour diaries can be really helpful, and they do start to appear to have patterns, and they can be really useful. So that might be something that you can think about using at home to keep track of your child's behaviour and help with understanding that. So next, let's think about Johnny's behaviour using the star analogy. So what are Johnny's actions? Then we'll think about his settings, then triggers, and then results. So again, I'll leave you a few minutes to think about this on your own, and then we'll come back together and I'll share some of my ideas with you. Okay, so we'll come back together. If you're not ready, then again, pause the video and come back in your own time. So let's start by thinking the actions. So what actions did we see from Johnny? So we saw shifting weight, hands over the ears, throwing his tray and running away. So hopefully you had some of those written in your action box. Next, the settings. So let's start by thinking about the personal settings. It was around lunchtime, so he probably was quite hungry, thirsty, maybe he was confused and feeling tired. So all of those will come under the personal environment. Um, Thinking about the environment around him, we've got the lunch hall. Again, it's noisy, it can be smelly, the bright lights, and it's busy. So you can see how we're sort of using the same information from the iceberg, but it's about formatting it differently, really. So again, so the settings can play a big role in perhaps how Johnny behaved. Next, we have the triggers. So what kind of triggers do we think Johnny had around him? So he seemed to be sort of choosing his food, the questioning, perhaps he wasn't understanding, maybe it's the way the question was asked, the fact that he was maybe last in line could have been a trigger. So just holding all of that in mind could have been small triggers that resulted in this behaviour. And finally, the results. So what results did we see? He ran away, possibly had no dinner, avoidance of the situation, and whatever else happened after he left that room. So did he leave that room and his favourite teacher went and comforted him and he got to eat his lunch in a separate room? Because in a way that's a real positive result from this behaviour. And he might be thinking, next time if I want to get out of the lunch hall and have lunch with Mrs. Smith in the classroom, I know what to do. I just need to throw my tray and run away, and that's what I'll get. So it's about just thinking about how do we react in a way to support your child but without giving them that positive reinforcement, because ideally I assume the school don't want Johnny to behave in this way every time he wants to remove a situation, but how can he manage the situation without showing these behaviours such as throwing a tray and running away. So again, this helps. This is just a way to show how you can put all the information out on one sheet of paper and try and make sense of it. And again, try doing this with your child's behaviour, because it really helps to understand about perhaps why they're behaving this way and what's going on around them. Now that we've analysed the behaviour and it's helped us to make sense of perhaps why Johnny behaved in that way, let's think about how we can support Johnny and how to help with his anxiety in these situations. So, for example, the first point could have been he does not understand the expectations. He didn't understand what was expected of him in that situation. So what can we do to support that? We could reduce language. There could be visuals. Perhaps the school could have given him the menu before he went into the school hall, so he could have decided what he wanted before he got there. Could he have had a menu? Could he have had photographs and objects of reference? So could he have had photographs of the school hall and the process explained to him in a bit more detail? Because then maybe that would have then eased his anxiety and his expectations of the situation. Inability to communicate clearly. So what was he trying to tell you? He needs a way of asking for help, which I guess is in a safer way than throwing a tray and leaving the situation. So can he have a card, or perhaps could he communicate in a way such as earlier in the day he'd written down his choice of what he wanted and he could have handed this to the person serving his food, because then he didn't have to communicate, but in verbally, but he still got his choice across. Sensory overload, thinking about the situation, the environment that was going on in that lunch hall. It was quite a stressful time for Johnny. It would have been noisy. Could he have, if he was last in the queue, could he have come in later so he didn't have to queue and he didn't have that build up of anxiety? Once everyone had received their lunch, could he have come in from the playground separately? Could there be a seating plan so he knew exactly where he was going to sit? He didn't have to worry about there not being a place for him. Could he have been given his lunch first so he could have sat down and got settled before the other children came in? So again, it's just making those reasonable adjustments that help support your child, especially with that sensory overload. And anxiety about the situation. So Johnny probably was feeling quite anxious about the situation, and that that may have resulted in him needing to let off steam. And it's just about finding ways that he can do this, which perhaps are safer. Throwing a tray may have hit another child, it may have rebounded and hit him, so it's not the best way of responding. If he needs to let off steam, has he got a place in the school where he could go to and just have some time out? Again, thinking about reducing that waiting time. Could he have come in at the last minute or skipped the queue? And having a buddy, having someone that could have helped him through this, someone that supported him in the wait line, distracting him from what was happening and preparing him and letting him know what's going to happen. So again, these seem in a way quite simple things of adjusting that situation, and in a way that they could have avoided the situation that Johnny went through. So again, after you've done the analysis of a child's behaviour, thinking back and reflecting on that situation, what could have been done differently to help support your child? If it's around anxiety, how could you reduce that anxiety? If it's communication, how could you communicate in a more effective way with your child? So it's all really important things to help keep in mind and make sense of your child's behaviour. And this is a really important quote to hold in mind, that overnight changes in your child's behaviour are not likely. It took them a long time to learn where they are, that in order to change that behaviour and get them to learn in a different way is going to be really difficult. So if you try something and it doesn't work straight away, keep trying it, because they need that consistent approach, and it's not going to happen just overnight. You're going to have to persevere in order to change your way of behaving with your child in order to help them change their behaviour. So for the final part of this presentation, we're going to look at positive behaviour management techniques. So what can we use to encourage positive behaviour in our children? So one thing we can do is ignore negative behaviour. So by ignoring, if we're responding to negative behaviour, we're at the risk of kind of positively reinforcing this behaviour. So our instincts, if a child was to behave in a, I guess, negative way, such as perhaps throwing something out of the classroom, the teacher's instincts may be to send them out of that classroom. But that child didn't want to be in there anyway. And so essentially they've won because they got to take themselves out of that situation, and now they haven't got to sit through the boring maths lesson that they were in. So if we can try and ignore the negative behaviour as much as possible and just reward that positive behaviour. So if we're seeing a child doing something really well, or they behaved in a way that you wanted them to, then reward that positive behaviour. And that could be with physical rewards such as star charts, and getting them to build this up. And over time, they will start to become aware that their positive behaviours are getting the rewards that they'd like, and their negative behaviours aren't really getting the attention that they wanted. So hopefully these will start to decrease. And it's really important that consistency is key. So thinking about at home, if there's more than one parent for the child there, or siblings, older siblings, it's important that you're all working together. So thinking about the rewarding. If one parent is rewarding a negative behaviour and the other person isn't, or one person is responding to the negative behaviour and the other parent is ignoring, the children are very clever and they will start to play parents against each other. So it's really important that all of you are being consistent in your approach. So you come up together that, you know, these are the behaviours that we're going to be rewarding, these are what we're giving the stars for, so that your child is used to that consistency. Also, the consistency helps make your child feel at ease and reduces their anxiety. If they're not sure how that parent is going to respond compared to that parent, then that increases their anxiety again. So it's beneficial to sit down with your partner and think about, okay, how are we going to do this together? And again, thinking about this, if you're separated and perhaps your child is going to mum's house one weekend, dad's house the other weekend, again, trying to maintain a consistent approach across both environments can be really helpful. And again, thinking about your own emotions as an adult. If you're becoming very emotional, you're handing your control over to the child. So you want to remain in control and try and remain calm in front of your child. Because in a way, some children may be trying to get that emotional response from you. So then they hold that control. So try and remain calm. And it's okay to remove yourself from the situation, calm down and come back and manage it. And taking that break that you need. We also want to try and empower your children. So thinking about wording of how we verbally communicate with the children. So can you get your shoes on? Thank you. Rather than can you go and get your shoes on, please? Because that way we're empowering them. By using the word thank you, we're assuming that they're going to go and do it and we're thanking them for doing it rather than using it as a question. So giving your child that independence and that power that they want and they crave. Children want that control. So by giving it to them in this way, but in a way that's controlled, that you're still having an element of control. They're still performing an activity that you wanted to. Again, being clear about the type of wording that we're used. Thinking about how stop is easier to process than don't hit. So just being very short, very concise with the language that we're using. And talk about good choices and mistakes, not bad choices. So trying to frame this in a real positive way. So saying about, oh, that was a good choice we made, oh, that may have been a bit of a mistake, because that sounds less harsh than bad choices. And don't say calm down. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you're so frustrated, and I think the worst thing a person can say to you is, oh, calm down, it's okay, because you don't want to be calm at that stage. It's about, okay, I can see, and just trying to relate with your child, I can see that things are really stressful at the moment. Why don't we go to your safe space in the house? And having a space that they can go to where they can calm down in their own time. So all of those points help together to enforce a positive behaviour management, and they're the kind of things that we want to think about when talking to our child. And in the moment, I understand it's really difficult to try and enforce these, especially when things are really heightened. Your child's anxiety is heightened, your anxiety is heightened. But if we can try and just get into the habit of using these, this will encourage a more positive behaviour response. So that's everything covered in this presentation. I hope it's been helpful. So I think the key messages from this parent carer workshop is about when we're thinking about understanding your child's behaviour, just trying to write as much of this down and make sense of it. Try and think about what's going on around your child, what happened before, what happened after, what was the response. Because I think when we write it all down, we can see it a lot clearer than perhaps we viewed it in the moment. So that would be my top tip, to write it down and make sense of it that way. Again, if you do have any questions or something hasn't made sense or you want to ask a specific question about your child, then please do email the autism service at cognus.org.uk and someone will be in contact to help you. Thank you for watching. Your feedback on this session is greatly appreciated in order for us to improve our service for other parents and carers. If you do have a spare 2 minutes to follow the link on the slide and fill out the feedback form, that would be great. The link is also in the description of the video if you're unable to access it via the slide. Once again, I want to thank you for joining me today, and I hope this has been a helpful experience for you.